Well, good evening. My name is Reid Porter. I'm an attorney here in Dallas and the founder and CEO of ACT, Advocates for Community Transformation. Over the past 12 years, we've been working to make neighborhood safety a normal reality for everyone in our city. And as you can see from the video you all just watched, when crime and violence plague a neighborhood, it negatively impacts the way children and their families can flourish in their communities. We recognize that our work at ACT is just one small piece to the entire puzzle in the larger framework and effort in needing citywide sustainable change, which is why I'm excited for you all this evening to meet friend and colleague Alan Cohen. He's the president and CEO of Child Poverty Action Lab, or CPAL, here in Dallas. And he's going to be sharing more about his work to reduce child poverty in our city and how those strategies intersect with our work at ACT in fighting against crime and violence. Alan's a Dallas native, and he's been leading CPAL's efforts as its CEO since the beginning. Alan, we're so grateful to have you with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Reid.
Alan, let's just begin for a minute. I'd love to hear you tell us a little bit about yourself, what led you to start CPAL, and then dedicate this season of your life to reducing child poverty.
So, CPAL really asked the question, is it possible for Dallas to work strategically enough and collaboratively enough to reduce child poverty by 50% within a single generation? The reason that matters a lot to me is I'd spent the last 10 years of my life before CPAL working on public education systems. How do we strengthen public education here in Dallas and in other parts of the country? And I just came to the conclusion that education and poverty were kind of two sides of the same coin. So we could ask ourselves, do we have so much poverty in the world because of failings in public education? Or does it appear we have such failings in public education because we have so much poverty? And the answer is yes. And the more that I kind of thought about it, the more I realized a lot of issues, whether it be basic needs or housing or public safety or jobs or entire economies or concern, all of these issues are symbiotically entwined. And if we're going to take on a task of literally having to lift tens of thousands of kids currently living below the federal poverty line in Dallas, above the federal poverty line in just a matter of a single generation, it was going to take approaches that attack the problem from multiple angles. And that was really exciting to me. And so that was really what was the pull to launch the Child Poverty Action Lab.
So as I understand it, the big vision of CPAL is to reduce child poverty by 50% in a single generation, right? I want to stop there for just a minute because I think that's a huge, ambitious and impactful goal. And I understand you've made some big bets, so to speak, as you call them, that really have informed your strategy to reduce child poverty. So tell us a little bit about those factors, and would you consider them root causes of poverty?
Yes, that's really what we focus on, is root causes. And what we realize is that if you want to reduce child poverty, what you really have to do is create pathways of economic mobility. So kids that currently are born into families that are in the bottom quintile socioeconomically, how do they do better generation after generation? So if you were born in the United States in 1940, you had a 90% chance of doing better than your parents had done by age 35 when you were age 35. And if you were born around when I was born, it's a coin flip. And we think it's less and less now. So what we realize is 1 in 3 kids in Dallas is born into poverty. And yet, it's harder than ever to do better than your parents have done generation after generation. And so we do have to look at these root cause issues. And so what we did is we took every think tank that we could find from the last 10 years all across the US that dealt with poverty. And we looked at all the drivers and outcomes related to poverty. We made this big list, and we had like lots of sticky notes, and it was really messy, and it was all kinds of fun. And then we started circling the things that just continued to come up over and over again in the research. And then we put that against the best research that we saw that was longitudinal, that looked at what were the factors related to poverty that happened during childhood that actually the research showed affected the chances of success in adulthood. And that led us to focus on 5 outcomes. We focus on basic needs, we focus on families, we focus on safety, we focus on education, and we focus on living wage jobs. And you'll notice even just when we talk about living wage jobs, we're talking about all of the factors that surround a child, because it's not that we're going to have a 4-year-old with a living wage job, but the parents having access to living wage jobs is one of the things that's going to break intergenerational poverty. And so the question became, if we could actually turn this into not just an audacious goal, Because you're right, that sounds 50% reduction in child poverty in a single generation. It sounds like we're going to boil the ocean. I'd been around a lot of sort of philanthropic, audacious goals, the kind of thing that's like, we're going to save the whales and we're going to do it by Thursday kind of stuff. And if we don't accomplish our goal, if we shoot for the moon, and we'll just land in the stars. And I don't want any part of that. I actually want to reduce child poverty by 50% in a generation. So I view this as a math equation. And what our analysis showed is if we hit these different milestones against each of those outcome areas, we actually will, the sum of those outcomes will ladder up to a 50% decrease in child poverty. And we're going to do that by structurally changing Dallas.
So as we think about those factors, it leads me to my next question, which is really, you were appointed co-chair of the Task Force on Safe Communities by Mayor Johnson back in 2019. So tell us about the goals of this task force, how it dovetails with the 5 factors that you're looking at CPAL, and then really what has the data and research that you've looked at really shown as you've looked at the landscape of the inequities in our city?
Real honor to be part of the Task Force on Safe Communities, and the mayor had a very clear goal with that. He wanted a task force to come together and to focus on violent crime and specifically murder. So we had seen a spike in homicides in Dallas, and we've been seeing that spike around the country over the last 18 months or so. And he wanted to look at strategies outside the realm of traditional policing. So what are those things that we could find and put into action in Dallas that were not just law and order strategies, but that could reduce violence in our neighborhoods? And so what we did was we looked at the very best practices from around the country. Where was it that data didn't just help us admire problems, but data actually showed us what solutions looked like? So where were places where there had been successes in other parts of the country? And we focused on a series of strategies, but I think one of the biggest insights that the task force got was that we do have these deep inequities across the city of Dallas. And focusing, sometimes when we think about violence, we focus on people. Who do we think is the violent perpetrator or the criminal, and how do we stop them? And really, we need to spend more time focused on place. What is the context that enables crime to take place or enables violence to take place? Now, like a lot of people at the event tonight, I felt like when I started this that I knew a lot about crime because I watched a lot of Law and Order, right? And so I knew that, right, a murder was most likely to happen in a dark alleyway, because the context is perfect for a murder to take place, right? You're in an enclosed environment, so it's easy for a conflict to occur and it's hard for somebody to run away from the conflict. You're away from anywhere where there's any traffic, so it's not like anybody's gonna intervene if a conflict starts to escalate. And then somebody's more likely to take a really violent action because they are more likely to psychologically feel like they can get away with it. Right, so that's true actually if we take it out of the dark alley and start thinking about how we've disinvested in entire neighborhoods. And when you have neighborhoods that have no good jobs, that have very little housing, that have blight all over the neighborhood, that have drug houses, those are attractive features for violent acts to occur. And if we invest in the neighborhoods and change the context, we can eliminate a lot of the crime. And so this idea of inequity in our city and the idea of violence, these things are symbiotically entwined also. And we can look at it as poverty has created the conditions for crime, but what we also have to recognize is that where there's gun violence in particular, where there's a lot of murder taking place, it's really difficult to focus on the root drivers of poverty. It's really hard to get businesses to create good jobs in a neighborhood where there's a lot of murder taking place. It is really hard to get folks to want to develop affordable housing where there's lots of gun violence taking place. And so one of the best things that we can do is actually use the strategies to eliminate gun violence so that we have the opportunity to deal with the structural issues of poverty.
So you talked about gun violence, you talked about some of the structural issues here. You've talked in the past as well about Dallas being an extremely segregated city, both by race and by wealth. You think about North Dallas, you think about South Dallas. Share a little bit more about what I would consider are pretty deep correlations between some of the factors you're starting to talk a little bit about this evening and really the opportunities that exist for individuals and children to flourish.
Yeah, so here's what we know from the research. And this isn't something that ideologically, I'm guessing. I mean, we actually know this from tracking generations of kids and literally the tax records of every child in the country and comparing them and then tying them to their parents' records and tying them to the next generation. So a child that is born in what we're going to call a low opportunity neighborhood, a neighborhood that's had deep disinvestment. Two kids are born in that neighborhood, and one of those children gets a housing voucher, and they move from that neighborhood to what we're going to call a high opportunity neighborhood, a neighborhood that has access to fresh food, a neighborhood that has access to good health care, a neighborhood that has access to jobs there. We know that in adulthood, that those two kids are going to have a difference of hundreds of thousands of dollars in lifetime earning. That's the difference between moving up socioeconomically and staying stuck for another generation and another generation. And it has everything to do with the context, the home, the neighborhood, the schools, the policies, the way people interact with one another on the streets of that the child is surrounded by. And so that's kind of what we mean. And that's why segregation is so evil in so many ways, is because it allows some people to be haves and some people to be left in the have-not category. But it also does this other thing, which is I've spent a lot of time. I grew up in a very affluent neighborhood in Dallas. I spent a lot of time with really affluent people. And sometimes this conversation almost feels like it's not a competition, but like we're blaming those that are affluent for the problems of those that have been born furthest from opportunity. And here's what I found out about most affluent people. Like, most people actually have really good hearts. Most people really want to help. And when there's a natural disaster on TV, like remember when there's a hurricane in Houston and like folks from Dallas got in their cars and they were driving into the storm? What I want you to understand is that like poverty is the invisible natural disaster. And what segregation does is it keeps it invisible. I could have spent my whole life in Preston Hollow and never seen poverty in Dallas. And I know there's a lot of folks in North Dallas that have the chance to never see poverty, and yet 1 out of every 3 children in Dallas has grown up in poverty. And I think that most people that have great means and that have affluence and that have been given lots of privilege in their life will want to help because of the moral imperative. But if you don't, do it out of self-interest. Because I'm just going to tell you, if you're stuck on a broken boat, only a fool takes comfort in the fact that the hole is on the other guy's side. This is going to affect everybody, and it's going to affect the entire economic future of our city. So you got to get involved.
Patrick Sharkey, who is someone I think we both admire. He's a professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton, and he's author of a book called Uneasy Peace, which is a book that we've studied as an organization. He concludes that violence is the central reason why neighborhood poverty is so damaging. Now, I know that you have several factors that you're looking at, including violence, but talk a little bit more about how poverty perpetuates crime and violence and really how those factors impact families and children.
Yeah, so again, I think this is a little bit about what we talked about earlier. So, the context of disinvestment, right? Like if you've got a very vibrant neighborhood where there's lots of folks on the street, where it's well lit, where there's jobs, where there's a lot of activity, it's really hard for bad stuff to take place. But if you're just hanging out by the abandoned home that's turned into the drug house, it's really easy for a lot of violence to take place. Here's the way that it just sort of continues to perpetuate itself. That a child that's grown up in poverty has 4 times the likelihood of having multiple traumas in their life during childhood. So, and one of those traumas that we document is exposure to violence. And here's what we know about the science of trauma. The more you're exposed to trauma, the more your physical development goes down, the more your cognitive development goes down, the more your behavioral development goes down. We can correlate very specifically something that we call adverse childhood experiences, or the number of trauma events in childhood, with success in adulthood. And we can correlate that whether you were born into affluence or whether you're born into poverty. It just so happens the likelihood that you're going to be surrounded by trauma is much, much higher in poverty. And so it does perpetuate itself in many, many ways. I don't think there's one answer to that question, but what I will say is that, again, Poverty increases the likelihood of violence. Violence increases the likelihood that you won't be able to address poverty. So we've got to deal with the violence so we can address the poverty so that the next generation doesn't have to live in intergenerational poverty.
And as you're studying, looking towards reducing the amount of child poverty within a single generation, and you're looking at ACEs particularly, how are you measuring the forward movement of that?
So, I mean, it's a really good question, right? So ACEs is a really hard measurement, okay? So the way that most folks in research measure adverse childhood experiences is that they give everybody in a neighborhood a survey, right? And the survey asks about different events that they've experienced in childhood. And what we're able to do is, again, correlate more traumatic events with worse adult outcomes. The problem is it's a cumulative measure. So it's really hard. If you go 1 year and you survey a neighbor and said, how many bad events did you have in childhood, they're going to fill out the survey. If you go back the next year, you're going to the same people who live in the same neighborhood, and you're saying, well, how many bad events took place? Well, you're going to get basically the same answer if it's cumulative. So what we've done is we start to measure the types of events that are taking place and the opportunities for trauma. So every time there's an aggravated assault with a firearm, that's an opportunity for trauma to take place. Every time that there's a 911 call and a report of child abuse, that is a potential trauma that's taking place. And so we take all that, and what we're trying to do is see over time, can we lower the opportunity for trauma to occur? Can we change the stimulus that surround kids? And then there's some things that we can just do that we know. For example, we know housing instability, like having to move from one home to another home to another home, mass eviction. These are things that we can address. And we know that a child that's able to live in a stable environment is going to face less trauma, again, than a child that is always on the move because they're always being kicked out of their home. So there's a lot of things that matter. And one of the most important things that's happened in my lifetime is the child tax credit getting expanded recently as part of the American Recovery Plan. We have already seen 2 months into the American Recovery Plan that by simply giving all families that have children in the home $300 and giving it directly to their bank accounts, we've had the lowest level of food insecurity that we've seen in my adulthood.
So as you're thinking about the violence and the crime in neighborhoods, it could be anything from family abuse to fist fights in a community. But if you think about what drug trafficking brings in, perhaps what things like prostitution, those kinds of negative experiences, it seems like to me that's also something, right? If you're able to remove those or remove them from a community, you're able to reduce the number of opportunities, so to speak, for those adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think what we've got to have is this balance between strategies and the immediate, right? That it's not okay to allow drug houses to exist in a neighborhood because it's really bad for everybody in the neighborhood. It's really bad for the collective on the whole. But also then we have to deal with a lot of the root cause, the long-term reasons why drug houses continue to pop up. Right? It's the lack of job opportunities that someone says, well, I've got to figure out a way to make a buck. It's the lack of hope. It's the child that is growing up in the southern half of Dallas, walks outside their home, sees the skyscrapers downtown, and doesn't believe that that office is for them. Those are things that have to be addressed if we don't want to be having the same conversation that you and I are having today 20 years from now.
So both CPAL and ACT have strong relationships with the city, and specifically the Dallas Police Department. So as we're looking to increase safety in our city, and we've talked a little bit about this already in the conversation, but getting more specific and actually naming it, we need both good policing and I would say perhaps non-policing activities to really reduce the rate of child poverty. So from your experience and your work at CPAL, talk to me a little bit about the role more specifically of non-policing or community-based solutions and how that can lead to sustainable change.
So I mean, there's so many different ways, but again, for example, someone is less likely to be out on the street if they have a stable home environment. If somebody is in a situation where they feel like they're completely backed up against the wall, their behavior is more likely to be affected. But also, like, take what we were talking about earlier, Patrick Sharkey and his book on Easy Peace, right? Fascinating findings within that book. When you really look at the data, one of the things that Sharkey found was that the number of community nonprofits that are just active within a census tract or within a neighborhood block, that has a direct reverse correlation with the level of violence in the neighborhood. So just by investing in community organizations and creating both jobs and positive activity, right? The presence of positivity, by definition, means that there's also an absence of negativity. And so those are big opportunities that we have as not just as a city, but with your churches, with whatever businesses you're a part of, corporations, to get involved. We've also seen, and we see this, we were looking at research as part of the mayor's task force that looked at blight in neighborhoods. We saw at the city block level, we could reduce the likelihood of gun violence by over 35% if we were to just remediate abandoned lots and abandoned homes. If we were just to put a fresh coat of paint, if we were, when a house is boarded up, if we were to replace that board with a door and actual windows, if we were to make sure that these lots that have grass growing up so high and look terrible, if we were just to mow the lawn and put a nice little fence around it, I mean, those are things that we can do immediately. They don't cost a lot, but they have a dramatic impact not only on the level of violence, but also in the dignity of the neighborhood.
So when you think about dignity and you think about a community really flourishing over time and really looking at sustainable change, how do you see the actual resident in the neighborhood, someone who cares for their community, perhaps they've lived there for 50 years, maybe they just moved in with their family. How do you look at the actual residents of the city of Dallas who are living in some of the low opportunity neighborhoods? What role can they play in really getting their communities back into a place of thriving?
And one of the greatest untapped resources in our city is people themselves. And what we know is that there's great context expertise that happens inside of a neighborhood. Is the residents of a neighborhood that understand who it is that's causing an issue, who it is that's also creating positivity in their neighborhood. It's residents in the neighborhood that understand the context as to why violence is occurring. It's residents that often have really good insights into solutions. And so there's this conversation that's happening in the social sector and in nonprofits. And the question is, should we focus on data or should we focus on lived experience? And it's set up as though there's like a tension between those two things. And I'm a total data person, and what I want you to know is that lived experience are just patterns that haven't been coded yet, right? If anybody that's at the event tonight works in consumer product goods, what do you do all day? You set up focus groups, you have qualitative data. And I used to come out of the consumer product goods industry. And what drove me crazy back in the days when my job was selling chocolate to folks around the country is that I had way more information at the neighborhood level about people when I was trying to give them diabetes than I did when I was trying to give them an education. We live in data deserts, especially when it comes to qualitative data. So again, it just comes back to that if we would listen, I'm just to tell you, go walk the streets in Dallas. People are happy to talk about themselves. They're happy to talk about their lives, and they have great ideas. And if we can just find a way to connect those ideas to those folks that are in power in City Hall, to those folks that are in power in corporations across Dallas that want to make a change, I guarantee everybody's going to be for the better as a result.
So we've spoken a lot about low opportunity, high opportunity, whether it be with individuals or neighborhoods. Help us understand a little bit more about some of these things that can be done, that actually can bring us as a city into a much greater sort of unified vision of bringing our communities up out of the poverty where they are today.
The first thing you can do is make sure that you call whoever your representatives are and tell them that you care about this, that you care in whatever neighborhood you're living in, that you care about inequality in the city, and that you care and make sure that everybody that grows up in Dallas, that it's the best place in the country to raise a family, irregardless of zip code, irregardless of race, that we close disparities, right? And here's the reason that's important. I was talking to one of my friends that works in the legislature in Austin, and they say every time they receive a phone call, they count it as 100 voices. The reason why is they assume that everybody that actually is willing to take the time to pick up the phone and make a call because they care about something, that there's at least 99 other people that care just as deeply as they do, but aren't actually going to go through the steps of telling someone about it. You'll have an outsized voice for what you care about if you're willing to pick up the phone. And the other thing is it'll connect you to government, okay? This is really, really important. That, again, 1 in 3 kids living in poverty, that is a problem of scale, of massive scale, and it's going to require solutions and resources of massive scale. It's going to require government. So here's what we know. We know even before COVID, even before stimulus and recovery plans and all of this new federal resources that are coming in, the federal government spent $1.1 trillion a year on the social safety net. $1.1 trillion in tax funds that flow through states and cities and into neighborhoods. All of philanthropy for the entire country spent $50 billion on the social safety net. What does that mean? That means that if we could just make government 10% more effective, we would effectively double all philanthropy in the country. And I've yet to meet anyone, regardless of ideology, that doesn't believe that government has at least 10% room for improvement.
You talk a lot about this idea of collaboration and working with one another and really getting past ideologies. How do we do that as a community? And is that the solution, or is that one of the solutions to truly bringing our children who are living in poverty in the city out of that state and into more of a flourishing environment?
Yeah, it's the only path forward. There's too many interdependencies for anybody to go it alone. And so, yeah, a root cause of the status quo maintaining, a root cause of inequality is our lack of ability to collaborate with one another. And you got to practice collaboration. It doesn't just happen. Okay, you know, for folks at the event that are part of the business world, when corporations come together, we hire M&A attorneys and we give them millions of dollars to help us figure out how to collaborate effectively. Well, we have to take that same level of investment and collaboration in the social sector as well, and in government as well. And I'll tell you, there are ways to practice this. So here's what I would recommend you do. Like if I had one thing that I could get everybody that's here tonight to do, it's go have coffee or drink with somebody that you deeply disagree with on an issue. Okay, like maybe you really believe that charter schools are evil, and your friend like loves charter schools and thinks that they're the best thing ever. Okay, and then just ask them, don't try to convince them that you're right and they're wrong. Instead, ask them why they believe what they believe. And continue to dig deeper and ask why over and over again until they really get to something. They're going to say something that you agree with. And whatever that something is, lean into that. Figure out how you can problem solve. So I'll give you an example from the task force on public safety that you asked about. So I'm somebody, I can't stand guns, right? Like I don't understand why we have guns. I've got friends that love guns, and they say, well, you know, I think they're just for killing people. They say, no, it's for target practice. I ask what you're practicing for. It's a whole thing. Anyway, one of the other members of the task force, again, loves guns. I mean, he's an absolute staunch believer in the Second Amendment and believes that, you know, that anybody that would be against guns is somewhat un-American. That's okay. That said, here's what we agree on. We both agree that murder is bad. That's enough for us to work on some stuff together. Okay? We don't have to agree on guns ever. There is enough common ground on murder being bad for us to lean in and work with each other. And that's what you got to practice doing. Stop trying to win conversations and start trying to identify common ground.
We've talked a lot about Dallas tonight. I know, though, that your data and research has also gone outside of the city. Would love to hear a little bit about what you've seen in terms of how Dallas compares to other cities, and if there are any barriers that you see that Dallas has that may be different from other places that you've studied.
Yeah, so look, I think one of the headlines that initially caught my attention to want to get involved in this is that Dallas at one point had the highest rate of child poverty of any major city in the country, and now we have the third highest rate of child poverty among any major city. So cities over 500,000 in over 1 million in population. That's not the list you want to be highest on. Okay, so in terms of how we compare to other major cities, not great in terms of the level of poverty. But let's look at this another way. Okay, one of the ways that other big cities deal with poverty is by pricing out all the poor people. Right. So what I think is that Dallas still has an amazing amount of diversity. We still have an opportunity to be an inclusive city. And so that the question is whether we're going to actually address poverty by lifting families up or by pushing families out. And I think that our best strategic opportunity, and I think our best moral opportunity, is to address this by lifting families up. So that's how I'd answer that question, but also by looking at the rate of change. And so we launched CPAL in 2017, or we began working on 2017. And this was after about 7 years of our last mayor having an initiative called Grow South, where he helped all the agencies in Dallas and all the nonprofits in Dallas and all the businesses in Dallas look at the disparities between North and South Dallas and made sure there was a spotlight on those disparities for 7 years in a row. And I think everybody got more and more intentional about their actions and cared more and more about closing those disparities little by little. And we got smarter about it and smarter about it. And then we've, as I said, gone through all this research to focus the conversation more and more on what data says gives us the best opportunity to reduce poverty in the city. So here's what's happened the last few years, is if I took all of the top 20 cities, over 500,000 in population, with the highest child poverty rates, and I look at who has made the most progress in the country at reducing child poverty, Dallas is #1 in our rate of child poverty reduction over the last several years. And if I were to look at Dallas compared to other regions in Texas, so you might just say, well, the state must be doing something, right? If I was looked at Dallas versus other regions in Texas, twice as fast in the reduction of child poverty as other Texas regions on that list. So I want us to be motivated by this, not just because of the moral imperative of not allowing 1 in 3 kids to grow up in poverty, but also because there is a chance to get this right. I'm not asking people to run into walls where there's no opportunity for success. This is something where we now need to lean in. It's a good indication that we shouldn't be taking victory laps, that we should be at a new starting line, and that we should be motivated to continue the path forward.
It sounds like Dallas is making great progress. I know we've shared a lot tonight, and yet I can only imagine we're scratching the surface on the vastness and the complexities that exist in this conversation. And you had mentioned at one point that it's all too easy to be numb to the overwhelming reality of child poverty. So there is this depth of brokenness in our society, and yet Dallas also seems to be rising to the occasion. How can each one of us here at Generation Justice tonight avoid the numbness and really push against that tendency to just not do anything because the problem is just too big? It's too overwhelming. So, I guess the real question for you right here is, what's the call to action? And what's the key in your mind as you think back on the last time we've been together and the conversation we've had so far in terms of unlocking community action? Call to action, how are we going to get the community involved?
So I believe that the pathway to action, right, is they take big complex problems and you just keep breaking them up into smaller and smaller pieces until you get to something tangible, so that, again, ideology kind of fades away and you're just trying to figure something out. And that could be as simple as, hey, I know of one family that's fell on hard times and is experiencing homelessness, and I'm going to figure out how to pull a group of folks together to help them get back on their feet. It could be as big as, I want to focus in on a neighborhood in Dallas and go and have conversations with residents and have them help direct me as to what I can do to help make it a more vibrant place. It can be, by, I'm going to go adopt a bureaucrat. I know that they have a lot of power and they could direct a lot of resources, and I'm going to see if I can help them get the data that they need or the numbers that they need, or they can be connected to leaders in the business community. But I think, if I was to say one thing that you can do, it's get out of the media conversation. Get out of this, every issue only has two sides, and lean in a nuance and go talk to people that you disagree with and find common ground. We have got to be a city that looks for opportunities to work together. And I actually believe that can happen as a groundswell. So I really encourage everybody to actually do that, not just to kind of nod your head and say, oh, that's a nice thought and whatever, but genuinely find somebody in your network that you disagree with and go find common ground. I promise you we can start a movement.
Alan, I want to thank you for taking time this evening and visiting with us. I'm incredibly encouraged by the big vision you have to significantly reduce child poverty in our city. Incredibly encouraged as well by the entrepreneurial and innovative ways that you guys are really working to make your vision a reality. You've really challenged and inspired us this evening to think about the root causes of poverty in a new way, and I want to really thank you for that. You know, one of the truths that motivates us at ACT to work for justice and peace in our city is really our Christian calling to love our neighbor and work for their physical and spiritual peace. We talk about it as shalom, or the way things ought to be. And you know, tonight, I feel like what you said in many ways is that poverty impacts all of us, right? Not just those of us that live in the southern sector. And so really, on behalf of everyone here tonight, I want to thank you and your team for living a life of compassion and loving your fellow neighbor. Be encouraged because you're doing incredibly meaningful and impactful work. And to our audience this evening at Generation Justice, thank you all for joining us as well. I know that many of you all have partnered with us for years, and you've got a deep hunger and thirst for doing what's right, for righting wrongs in our city, and seeking the welfare of our community. So thank you for being with us. And for those of you all that are new tonight to the conversation, my hope and prayer is that tonight's conversation will have been an open window of sorts into a new knowing of the way things can and ought to be. So Alan, thank you again for being with us. And to you all at Generation Justice, I look forward to seeing you all soon.